Hi there, this is Jeff Kassman. Welcome to Tradition. This is a series of conversations I have with smart people who are informed about the Catholic faith. And today I have a special guest, Charles Coloumbe. Charles, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here, Jeff. Thanks so much.
So today we are talking about some interesting topics: democracy, representative government, Catholicism in the state, and we'll probably talk a little bit about the King of England as well. Charles, before we get into all of that, would you give those who are watching and listening who may not be familiar with you and your work a little bit of your background?
Woof. Well, let's see. I was born at an early age. No, I'm 62. I was born in New York City when I was all of 6. They moved me to Hollywood, California, where I lived most of my life, except for a few stints elsewhere. 2 years at New Mexico Military Institute, beautiful Roswell, New Mexico. A few other places, but mostly Los Angeles area until about 5 years ago, when I came to Trumau, Austria, where I am at the moment. I've just graduated from their MA and the Sacred Theology master's course, Master's in Sacred Theology. I've been a professional writer since my first book came out in 1987. I was a stand-up comedian before that. And so I'm afraid I do joke a lot. So don't be put off. I haven't necessarily gone off my rocker, although, well, never mind. I've written, 14 or 15 books. My last few was the history of the Papal Zouaves, the Pope's Legion, about the lads that went off to fight for Pius IX, 1860 to 70, from all over the world. There was Star Spangled Crown, which was the closest I've come to fiction, about a supposed future American monarchy. The Catholic quest for the Holy Grail, which is just what it sounds like. It was about the Holy Grail. And my last book was Blessed Charles of Austria, The Legacy of a Holy Emperor, about Blessed Karl of Austria. I'm working as we speak on its companion volume on his wife, Servant of God, Zita. And interestingly enough, his feast day is not his death day, but their wedding day. And so without a doubt, if as and when she's beatified, they'll have a joint feast. And I'm also working at the same time, and have to deliver the same day, a collection of the writings on the United States of their son, the Archduke Otto von Habsburg, whom I knew somewhat. We corresponded from the time I was in high school, and I met him a couple of times. But my interests, of course, lie in, first and foremost, Catholicism, monarchy, literature, history, folklore, all sorts of things. I'm all over the map, really. I have a podcast, a couple of podcasts of my own, Off the Menu on the Tumbler House YouTube channel, and The Never Ending Struggle, which is specifically chapters in church history for Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And you can see my periodical work in Catholicism.org, the European Conservative, Crisis Magazine, and 1 Peter 5.
Very good.
There.
And are you a cradle Catholic?
Yeah. And I cradle Catholic, I never stopped practicing. But I am a canonical member of the Ordinariate, one of the very, very few cradle Catholics who are. And the reason for that, in a nutshell, is that way back when I was a teenager in Hollywood, my confessor was James Francis Cardinal McIntyre, the then retired Archbishop of LA. He was the one I first saw the Tridentine Mass with, because he would say it every day on a side chapel at St. Basil's. But bear in mind, this is the mid-70s, and His Eminence was of the opinion that my faith was being drained out of me slowly through lack of exposure to decent liturgy. Long and the short of it was, he sent me to a place called St. Mary of the Angels, not to receive communion, It was an Episcopal church in those days. But he said, you'll see an approximation of how liturgy should be handled. This was the year, though, that the Episcopal Church adopted the ordination of women in 76. And so I got to know St. Mary's very well, and I was, as it were, alongside when they left the Episcopal Church and when they attempted to join the Catholic Church. They were ultimately the root, or part of the root, of what was called for a long time the pastoral provision, and then subsequently the ordinariate. Because a godson of mine is an ordinariate priest, founded an ordinariate community in Southern California. I was at the beginning of that, and he asked me. There was a very, very short period where if you were a founding member of an ordinariate community and you were a cradle Catholic, you could join the ordinariate canonically. So he asked me, he said, would you want to do that? And I said, and leave the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, which has nurtured me spiritually so well since childhood. I'll have to think about that. I've thought about it. I'll do it. And so, and that was how I became one of the few cradle Catholic members of the ordinariate. Now you know.
How interesting. For folks who don't follow these kind of internal canonical structures maybe as closely as you and I do, would you give us a brief background on the ordinariate?
Sure. Back in 2000, I want to say 2011, Benedict XVI, having received the applications of a number of groups of Anglicans around the world to come into the church as groups, created 3 ordinariates to receive them. And these would be diocesan-like structures. The ordinary might or might not be a bishop, but he would be a member of the Conference of Bishops in the country. And in the case of the confraternity, or the ordinariate of the Chair of St. Peter, which encompasses the United States and Canada, our Bishop Lobsch is a member of 2 conferences, the Canadian and the American. The ordinariate of the personal ordinariate of Our Lady of Walsingham encompasses England and Scotland, and then the ordinariate of Our Lady of the Southern Cross encompasses Australia and places around there.
And I've always been curious that the ordinariate does not offer the Sarum rite, but rather offers a more modern rite. Could you explain for those who are listening, who are interested in traditional liturgy, what the rite is that the priests of the ordinariate are offering, and how that compares historically and liturgically to, say, the Sarum rite, the traditional Latin rite, and the Novus Ordo?
Boy, that's a good question. Well, firstly, we got to know what the Sarum rite was, and the answer is the Sarum rite was the primary use in England prior to the Reformation. It didn't differ from the Roman rite that much. In fact, it was like the Lyonnaise rite of Lyon, which the Curé d'Ars used, and which was used up until the excitement post-Vatican II, when in the name of diversity, we had to suppress anything that wasn't the same. Anyway, sorry, I get confused when I read too many church papers and try to make sense out of them. Anyway, move along. Seriously, the bull of St. Pius V, Quo Primum, that established the Tridentine rite as the standard of the Roman rite, suppressed most local rites like that, because most of them were quite new. But it allowed any rite, any Western rite that was 200 years or older to continue. So the Sarum rite, legally speaking, has never been abolished. But what did happen was that because the priests for the English mission were trained in Rome during the penal times, they were trained in the Tridentine Mass, the Tridentine rite. And after the last of the Marian priests, the priests of Queen Mary, died off, there basically was nobody to say it. So that was the de facto, but not de jure, end of the Sarum use. there have been from time to time movements within the church to revive it. And actually, it could be done. But bear in mind, the current climate that we're in right now is, and by climate, I mean the Holy See. 85 grinder accounts, got to be careful. I wouldn't hold my breath on anything happening there right now, because everything has to be approved by the Holy See, and the Holy See are, well, they're too busy approving parish bulletins to do anything else. They've got to be approved one by one, and there are a lot of parishes in the world, for the Holy See to go through every bulletin every Sunday. But we hear and obey. Anyway, so to answer your question as to what the Ordinariate uses, and mind you, there's been a lot of talk amongst various people in the Ordinariate about the possibility of one day having the Sarum Rite as sort of the extraordinary form for the Ordinariate. But believe me, we're a long way from that, for any number of reasons. Why can't we have a Tridentine Mass in St. Peter's? I don't know. Ask the Archpriest. Why don't they use Latin in St. Peter's anymore, even for the Novus Ordo? Ask the Archpriest. Why don't they have any Mass but one in St. Peter? You get what I'm saying. So while things are as they are, we can't expect things to be other than they are, if that makes sense. But it's like this. You were familiar with the Oxford movement and Anglo-Catholicism and all that?
Yeah.
All right. Well, what happened was that a group of people, of whom Cardinal Newman was one, Pusey was another, John Keble, they decided that the Church of England was really a Catholic church, part of a sort of invisible three-branched church made up of the Roman Catholic, the Eastern Orthodox, and oddly enough, the Church of England. So they conceived it as their mission to re-Catholicize the Church of England. And so over the course of the 19th century, they reintroduced all sorts of things. Prayers for the dead, belief in the real presence, prayers to Our Lady and the saints, monks and nuns, all kinds of stuff. Eucharistic vestments, which were not used by the Anglicans prior to that time. All this stuff was revived. And also, they basically revived a sort of form of the Mass using bits and pieces of the Book of Common Prayer, which was Cranmer's translation of bits and pieces of the Sarum Rite, if you see where we're going with this. And they filled that out, either or both, with stuff from our own Roman Rite, the Tridentine version, or the Sarum Rite, or both. And so in the last end of the 19th, early part of the 20th century, you had what were called the English Missal, or the Anglican Missal, which was very similar to the Tridentine Mass in English in terms of what you would see. Now, as you know, after Vatican II, we brought in the Novus Ordo, and we generally turned the priest around and did all sorts of fun things, as well as eliding. There's a wonderful word, eliding a number of the prayers. There was a segment amongst Anglo-Catholics, the Papalists, who believed, unlike some Anglo-Catholics, who thought, well, we're a Catholic church, like the Catholic Church, like the Orthodox, we don't need nothing, especially we don't need the old guy in Rome. But the Papalists said, no, you want to be real Catholic, you've got to be in union with the Holy See. And so their desire was to move the whole of the Anglican communion into communion with the Pope. And there was a whole set of societies and structures and so forth supporting that particular aim. Well, a lot of Papalists, after Vatican II, discarded the English Missal for our own Roman Missal, for the new Mass, our new Mass. So if you go into a church like St. Pancras Old Church in London today, there's the new Mass, just like we would do it. even facing the people, as a sign of union with Rome. You might call that the wrong execution of the right idea, if you like, but there it is. Now, having said all of that, when the pastoral provision, which was the first attempt, was purely in the United States, it came about in the 80s to try to accommodate people of this sort, the liturgical radicals were very much more in power in Rome than they would be later. And so the divine worship book of that time was sort of a melding of the Book of Common Prayer and the New Mass, which was not something, it was something unusual for Americans, where the Anglo-Catholics had never really gone to the New Mass very much. But had it been done in England at the time, and it wasn't because there was no ordinariate in England, we had nothing for them, it would not have been that strange to them. All right. Fade in, fade out. You have the ordinariates established. The ordinariate liturgy has a lot of variations. There are a lot of options, shall we say. Depending on which ones you use, it can look very much like a new Mass. It can look like the Tridentine Mass in English. Whatever it looks like, it has to be ad orientem. The first Eucharistic prayer, the Roman canon, is, at least in the ordinary churches I've gone to, it's what's used. I've never seen anything else. And usually the ceremonial and all that, you would recognize very much from the Tridentine Mass. Even at its most quote-unquote novus ordo way, it's generally done with a great deal more reverence and attention than you'll see in a lot of places. And of course, whatever it looks like, it's also in Elizabethan English. It's not in Novus Ordo English. So it's always a very different. And then there are certain things that were kept from the Book of Common Prayer that are general. The prayer of humble access and the prayer of thanksgiving after communion, which are both done by the congregation as a whole. So it's really quite an extraordinary thing. When I'm home in Los Angeles, what I generally do, I have to admit, I double dip, and I go to the Ordinariate Mass in the early morning, and the Tridentine Mass in the late afternoon. Well, not late, early afternoon. So I double dip. There, my secret's out. I don't care. I'm not ashamed.
Thank you for that background. I think that's very helpful as a foundation for the rest of our conversation, since Americans, for the most part, came from an Anglo culture, and our certainly our founding fathers and founding principles and concepts obviously were all Anglo in origin.
And that, if I may, there's an important point there too. It's important to bear in mind that the Ordinariates were not founded simply to preserve them like a museum, nor even just to share them with other Catholics, although that too was a part of it, because the Anglo-Catholics held on to a sense of reverence and so forth that was lost, for the most part, in the Western Church. I mean, and you can argue about that. You can say that's not nice to say. Okay, it's a hate fact. Kill me. But it's true. And Benedict knew it, and he said as much. But beyond that, there was also the ideal of using it as a means of evangelizing the Anglosphere. You know, part of the problem we Catholics have dealt with, and mind you, I'm French Canadian on my dad's side, and you know, I know French Canadian American Catholicism, and I'm proud to be part of it. The current bishop of the Ordinariate in America, Bishop Loeb, is Portuguese descent, and same thing. He grew up with an ethnic Catholicism, a Portuguese Catholicism. In my conversations with him, it hit me that what we both saw was the need for a Catholicism that would be as authentically Anglo as what we grew up with was French or Portuguese, if that makes sense. And mind you, I think both of us would insist that our particular national form of the faith is obviously the best. But of course, we don't live in a francophone or a lusophone country. So what you're touching on right now, the evangelization of the Anglosphere, is precisely why the ordinariates exist.
So this is there's a lot of things that we could talk about that you've touched on, but I want to get to kind of the central point of our discussion today about government. And
Yes.
And certainly in 2023 here in the United States, government and questions about government and morality and legitimacy and prudence, government form, I think are more present in the minds of a lot of Catholics than perhaps in many generations, perhaps since the war between the states or even the founding, as we see kind of our civilization collapsing in front of us. On the foundation that you've just established, talking about our Anglican English roots in a lot of ways, especially the government, as a rejection of the English monarchy, how should Catholics think about government, the secular central state?
Well, the first thing you've got to understand, we have to understand, is that the whole idea of the secular state is a creation of the Protestant revolt, or rather the aftermath of the Protestant revolt. The religious wars in France and Britain and Germany were pretty nasty affairs. Spain and Portugal, of course, escaped them because they had the Inquisition, so they didn't have to worry about it. But for those who did not, and mind you, when you consider how few people were actually offered over to the state by the Inquisition, it was a very, very tiny price to pay, as opposed to the thousands upon thousands who died in those other countries I mentioned. But we'll set all that aside. So the first thing that has to be borne in mind is that the secular state itself, like the Protestant state from whence it came, is a rejection of the original Catholic ideas of governance. Now, mind you, that having been said, those ideas are only practicable in a place where you have a Catholic population. To try to impose them on a non-Catholic population would be a little bit like the Renaissance Fair. Not that I mind the Renaissance Fair, I'm an avid goer, but it's not my point. So the thing is that we have two problems here. One is we have an ideal of governance, which actually comes to us, believe it or not, ultimately from the Last Supper, oddly enough, where our Lord united his Davidic kingship, to which he was the rightful heir, with the communio of the church. And from that time on, although it would be a couple of hundred years before we had any Catholic monarch considered his rulership to be participation in the kingship of Christ. And from that came both what his subjects expected out of him and what he'd expect out of himself if he was a decent individual. Considering the number of saints that were Catholic royals, they had more than their share of decent individuals. Anyway, the thing is that starting with Armenia becoming Catholic en masse in 303, culminating in the empire turning Catholic in 380, being baptized also meant entrance into the body politic as well as the church, because in a sense, church and state were different aspects. They were distinct, but they were different aspects of the same Christian body. Well, then you've got the Reformation. And now before that time, if you were a heretic, a Muslim, a Jew, you weren't a full citizen because you were outside that communion that was at once church and state. But again, they weren't the same as they are with the Muslims. I've heard people compare the Catholic state to the Muslim state. Well, they're totally different, partly because the faith is different, and that will bring about different results, but also because there is not a separation between the two structures in Islam as there is in Catholicism. But anyway, I digress. So now, after the Protestant revolt, Catholics are also outside the body politic. And then it's not just Catholics, but then you've got all sorts of other sects that arise. So slowly but surely in the Protestant countries, more or less peacefully, the modern secular state arises, where bit by bit by bit by bit, religion means less and less and less and less and less in terms of your participation. In Scandinavia and Britain and the Commonwealth, they are experts at maintaining the form when all the substance is gone, but they still maintain the form. In Catholic countries, because Catholics are kind of incapable of doing that, I mean, that's why the liturgy had to change in the end, is because the clergy who mattered didn't really believe the faith that it offered. So similarly, rather than this peaceful evolution of the secular state, in Catholic countries, you had to have violent revolutions to get there. There was no way around that. And then in the United States, you ended up with a bizarre combination of the two. Because with us, unlike the French Revolution or the Spanish Civil War or anything like that, in the United States, you already had a liberal Protestant regime. Now the thing was to take it a step further beyond Protestantism to deism. And so they did. Now, that puts us where we are now. Now, the reason why the American experience was able to, in a certain sense, certainly outwardly do so well, was for two reasons. One was that despite the religious disparity, and this was true, by the way, before the Revolution, where each colony was, even though in the New England colonies was the Congregational Church, the Southern colonies was the Anglican, and then a few of them had no established church. Whichever the case, there was moral consensus. The different kinds of Protestants, the Catholics, the Jews, all believed the same sorts of things were right and wrong, pretty much. And that's an important thing to understand, because it was the key to our country being able to manage it all. Prior to the Revolution, the other thing they had that built unity, and it was the only thing next to this foundation, this moral foundation, was the image of the king. The defender of Protestantism against the evil French and Spanish and Indians, he was it, which was why he was regarded in a somewhat different light than the way he was regarded in Britain, even though he never came to America. And I say he in the singular because he was as much a symbol as anything else. It didn't matter if it was George III or George I or William and Mary. So then you had, of course, the French Indian Wars. The French are defeated, sadly, in my estimation, but we'll leave that aside. And now King George III is forced to switch sides, as it were, partly because he'd been in favor of Catholic emancipation anyway in the beginning of his reign, which is why he was popular in Ireland. But by treaty, he swore to treat his new French and Indian subjects as though they were his own born. Well, what that meant practically was that the penal laws could not be applied to Canada. And so they did a number of makeshift measures, but in the end, they came up with the Quebec Act in 1774, which guaranteed my ancestors their freedom, religion, and laws. Now, that was not taken too happily down south. Remember what I said about the king being the symbol, amongst other things, the protector of Protestants against the French and Indians. Well, the Quebec Act, for a lot of people, especially amongst the leadership of the colonies, looked like he was switching sides. So that's incidentally why the Quebec Act is denounced in Orwellian terms in the Declaration of Independence. Anyway, you have the revolution. The king's gone. And now what? Well, the now what was this. The first decade or two after the revolution, alongside initially the building of the Constitution and all that, was the creation of what people are pleased to call the civic religion of America. The divinization, if you will, of American history, where it goes from being history, like every country has, to being salvation history. And so the Pilgrims, the early Puritans, are like the children of Israel. They make and this is a very Calvinist thing, by the way. The Ulster Scots and the Afrikaners do the same thing. They radically identify with the children of Israel. So you have the Pilgrims coming across from slavery under Pharaoh in England to, they make the exodus to America. They meet all these Canaanites, French and Indians. And there they are in the promised land. Well, you then have the revolution, the Constitution, the New Covenant. And that American faith was actually very consciously created by people like Noah Webster. And it was very effective because it allowed a certain sense of sacredness that in most countries would be reserved to a monarchy. It allowed that to be adduced to the country itself and to its instruments of governance. But it was very tightly connected to that moral code, which is why even today, if I say something is un-American, I mean, if you say to a Frenchman or an Italian or a Spaniard, something's un-French, un-Italian, or un-Spanish, they'll look at, okay, it's foreign, what's your point? But when you say something is un-American, that has all sorts of connotations of moral turpitude. Because good Americans are moral people.
Yeah, it's almost saying that it's diabolical, right?
Yeah, almost. It's certainly bad and it's immoral. Now, these two things together, that national faith and that moral consensus, had a lot of advantages. It allowed people of all religions and none to collaborate in this project we call the United States. It allowed people to say things, and this made sense in the day, but not so much now. The United States aren't a country, they're an idea. You know, and it doesn't matter where an American is born. It's who he is. You know, this sort of thing, which sounds wonderful. We all grew up with it. Sounds great. But there were a couple of little problems with it. And those little problems are what have broken open and given us trouble today. Let me make one quick historical note because it has a parallel to the present. You know that in New England, as Calvinism slowly died, there was a flip to Unitarianism. Modern Unitarianism comes out of Calvinism. And it's, on one level, it's the opposite of Puritanism, but it's simply Puritanism turned on its head. Please keep that idea in your mind for a moment. So we'll fast forward. Everything's fine. We're getting more and more American. We fight 2 world wars. We have the Chapel of the 4 Chaplains. We have Flag Day and Americanism Day and Loyalty Day and Law Day and all kinds of good stuff. And it's wonderful. Yeah. Then come the 60s. And the moral consensus that united the country, that ultimately allowed Democrats and Republicans to be not too different from one another, really. They differed in means, but really not too much in ends. That moral consensus being destroyed, the foundation for the national religion was destroyed. And over the course of the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, it withered. Now, remember what I said about Calvinism flipping into Unitarianism. Well, as President Reagan, who was this great elite prophet of the American religion, as any who ever lived said. America, stealing it from John Winthrop, of course, is the shining city on the hill, the last best hope of mankind. Okay, you flip that, and you got your woke. It's the most horrible country that ever existed, born in genocide and built in slavery. Well, and the problem then is that for those, bearing in mind we no longer have that moral unity, for those who lose the old religion, it becomes as hateful as Catholicism was to the Protestants at the Reformation. And that is what gives wokery its strange vampiric power. Now, just to one more point, and then I think we'll have the body out on the dissecting table. And that is, that's a wonderful picture. And then, no, but seriously, the thing is that where all this really came home to me, believe it or not, was Mr. Trump's Mount Rushmore speech, which you may recall was it was January or February of 2020. He gave a speech on Mount Rushmore, hence the name. And of course, his supporters thought it was the greatest thing since plaid paint. And his enemies, you know, obviously the devil incarnate was once again tempting the faithful. But what hit me about the speech was that it was boilerplate. It was something any politician of either party could have said when I was a boy, and everybody would have cheered. So it went from being a reiteration of the American creed to being a pure party thing. And perforce, the other party has adopted wokery. And so now we are stuck with the two things that provided our nation unity, that moral consensus and the religion of the country, dead as dodos. And what's binding America now? Two things, well, three things: habit and institutional power. And that, neither of those last forever. And that's the problem we are stuck with right now. In my book, Star Spangled Crown, apart from exploring monarchy in the abstract, and the Christian monarchy in the abstract, and it was easy to do that because when you're dealing with the United States, looking at it that way, you have to look at monarchy as an abstraction rather than French, Spanish, British, etc. But the other thing, which was in some ways to me more important, was exploring the notion of an American patriotism rooted in the reality of the country as it is, rather than either being the last best hope of mankind or the worst country that ever was. Because, it's just like your father doesn't have to be man of the year, and your mother doesn't have to be Miss Universe for you to love them. They're your parents. That's all they need. There's no further justification required out of you to love your parents than the fact that they're your parents. But the same is true of your country. It doesn't need to be this idea that brings hope to men. All it needs to be is the land where your fathers died, the place where you were either born or came to because of opportunity or fear of whatever was going to wait for you at home. It doesn't need more than that. It really doesn't. If you're a Catholic, however, that's not enough. Because as Catholics of pagan countries, it would be true if you were Japanese or Indian, you also, if you're a patriot, if you really love your country, you have an obligation to evangelize her. A truly loyal Catholic American, a truly patriotic Catholic American, has to see evangelization as part of being a patriot.
One of the things, and you've touched on a lot of great topics here, but one of the things that's central to the American religion is this idea of the separation of church and state. And those who've done any research, they already know, of course, that's not in the Constitution, in a kind of a literal sense. You mentioned briefly the English model, where you said that they kept kind of the form of the old Catholic society, but without really in practice, and how it's different from the Muslim model, in which there's no division of governance. As we start to look towards the English monarchy, because it's been a big year for the English monarchy, I want to talk about that. Can we say that the American experiment has definitively failed?
Well, that's only if you're willing to admit that there was an experiment at all. I mean, that's a very ideologically based question. I mean, it's like if we ask about the French experiment or the British experiment, there's not experiments, they're countries. This is what I mean. And they're very looking at it as an experiment makes it ideological. And it also gives the impression that there were people who knew what they were doing sitting in the background, measuring this out and trying to figure out, a country is a country is a country is a country. The American experiment hasn't failed because it wasn't an experiment. The United States may fall apart because countries can do that. The United States may cease to be united. That could happen. The Union could fail. But you see, these are concrete. What our Achilles heel has been this very problem that when you boil us down, we put our trust in intangibles. And they're intangibles that aren't real. I mean, it's one thing if you put it in the faith. It's another thing if you put it in the vision of men who were fallible men who lived 200 years ago, and you're going to invest them as religious prophets. Well, they weren't. What they were a very able bunch of, men who seized power from the old regime. Although it says something about the old regime that we have never yet produced a generation as able as they were, products of the very regime that they got rid of. So that might tell you something also. But nevertheless, able as they were, and even though they talked, a lot of them being deists and Freemasons, not all, many of them were devout Protestants of different kinds, but they may even have looked at it that way. But we don't have to. What we have to be concerned with is the country that we've inherited. I've said earlier that in the Declaration of Independence, the Quebec Act is denounced in Orwellian terms. And that's not something I like very much, being a descendant of beneficiaries of said Quebec Act and being a devout Catholic. But when I celebrate the 4th of July, believe it or not, that's not what I'm celebrating. I'm celebrating the United States that I live in. The country that gave the world vaudeville and the polio vaccine, the American songbook, and the golden age of Hollywood, and so much in the way of scientific advancement, you don't know where it ends. These are tangible realities that we actually did. We're a very peculiar country. We've got a very strange history. It's interesting that for most of our history, our popular entertainment was created by by marginal minorities, Catholics, Jews, and blacks. But we came up with jazz, and all the world took it. We came up with the Broadway musical, and these things. I mean, look at our three first great writers: Washington Irving, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Edgar Allan Poe. All right, some people would push in James Fenimore Cooper. Fine, you're a Cooper fan, we'll let him in. I don't care. I'm not exclusive. But these were the first American writers to make the world sit up and take notice, and they were American. They were very much influenced by Europe, as we all are, because we Americans are Europeans. That's something we have to get over. We're Europeans. But we're Europeans who, like the Australians, the Canadians, and New Zealanders, were formed by the country we settled in. We formed it, it formed us. So, again, when you say, has the American experiment failed? I really can't answer that question in those terms. Has the American government failed? Has the Constitution failed? Has the Great American Compromise failed? There we're on more solid ground. There is the Union endangered. There, if you pose the question in those ways, yeah, we got problems in River City. In the immortal words of Robert Preston, the Music Man. As for the experiment, certainly the American ideology, I think, has died. Whether or not you could say it's failed is a whole other issue. Because ideologies, they don't fail to succeed. They just are. So I would say that for the country to survive, it has to find a new basis of union. I believe that to be true. As I say, you mentioned separation of church and state. Here's the funny thing. It doesn't exist. Every state has an animating philosophy, an animating principle, usually not always religious. In the Soviet Union, it was communism. There is no God, and Lenin is his prophet. And that was what gave the Soviet Union and its colonies legitimacy. It's where authority came from. It's what gave you the rules to play by or to break. Well, every state has that. So do ours. My church may very well be separate from the state. Oh, yes, indeed. But a church of sorts, the state will always have, and vice versa. Because the state is like, without an animating principle, it's like a robot. It's a zombie. And that can't last for long. Something will animate it, something will motivate its ruling classes. And of course, what motivates our ruling classes now is this weird post-Christian liberalism. 100 years ago, it was a vague kind of Christianity. You remember the Supreme Court in the 1890s ruled that the United States are a Christian country. Now, what they meant by Christianity was probably not what you and I would mean by it. It was really the totality of all the sects that call themselves Christian. Nevertheless, that was the faith of the rulership 130 years ago. Now it's this gooey thing. But like any other faith, heretics will be punished. And if you don't go along, you'll be unhappy.
Speaking of heretics, let's shift and talk about the English monarchy.
Okay.
Right. For those of us that are trying to be devout Catholics, we look back on our history, especially if we have Anglo backgrounds like most Americans do, and we can't help but think about King Henry VIII and that break from Rome, and so much of what the English monarchy represents to us is heresy and schism. It was
which would be more applicable to our founding fathers, actually.
Well, yes, they certainly mastered that form, right?
Well, you see, and here's an important point. There's a double standard. if you use the same keen eye that we're supposed to use on Henry VIII, on the founding fathers, guess what? You'll come up noticing what they said about the Quebec Act. That's what. So there's the first step right there. Henry VIII was not a nice person. I hate to shock anyone, but it's true. However, notice that even he had to pretend to justify his actions according to the law. He was not an absolute monarch in the sense that the government we live under today is. He couldn't change marriage. He couldn't have brought about gay marriage. And he couldn't have decided that the unborn aren't human beings. He didn't have that power. And, he probably would never even thought of it. But we think of the English monarchy as Henry VIII because we don't know anything, and because we're taught the same people that teach us that the Constitution was brought by the Holy Ghost teach us that every monarch since Henry VIII has in fact been Henry VIII, or Henrietta in the case of Queen Elizabeth. But there were still gender distinctions in her day. Now, of course, we'd be different about that. Anyhow, I digress. We forget several things. First and foremost, that the Stuart kings, with the exception of the first of them, Elizabeth's successor, James, and we totally forget Queen Mary Tudor, of course, who tried to bring the faith back to England. We forget her right away. We forget how well the Stuarts generally did for the Catholics in America. Even Queen Anne, who had partaken in the betrayal of her father, James II, saved the Catholics of Maryland. I expect you weren't aware of that. No, well, it was like this. Maryland, and what happened was this: under King Charles I, Maryland was established by his friend Lord Baltimore as a refuge for Catholics. It was named ostensibly after his queen, Henrietta Maria, but wink, wink, nudge, nudge. She was Catholic. Even James I's wife was Catholic. They all married Catholics. But the Maryland, they knew that they were actually named after Our Lady. It was, named after the Queen. So Catholics and Prods were given equal rights, which later on turned out to be a bit problematic. Then you have the English Civil War, and King Charles I is murdered by Cromwell for three major reasons. One, he refused to accept getting rid of the bishops of the Church of England. Two, for his negotiations for reunion with Rome. And three, for his his opposition to the enclosures, which were the well-to-do folk basically taking over lands that drove people off their property and into the cities. So both Virginia and Maryland, New England, of course, the good Puritans were very happy that Cromwell won. Nothing quite like Plymouth Rock, as they say. But the evil Southerners in Virginia and Maryland were very much opposed to this. And so Cromwell sent a fleet to reduce them. And that's why the last of the wars of the Three Kingdoms the last battle was in Maryland in 1652. So Charles II is restored 1660. Maryland goes back to Lord Baltimore. But then in 1688, King James II is overthrown, and there's a series of revolutions in the colonies. They get rid of Governor Andros in Massachusetts, Governor Dongan in New York. And then in Maryland, it becomes Lord Baltimore is deprived of his property of Maryland, and Maryland becomes a royal colony. Well, the Protestants of Maryland take over, lock, stock, and barrel, and they begin applying the penal laws piece by piece by piece, not all at once. Finally, in 1710, I think, they pass a bill which makes the faith completely illegal. The Catholics of Maryland appealed to Queen Anne, and she did something terrible. She vetoed a bill passed by a popularly elected legislature. Dun, dun, dun. Tyranny was supreme. And so the Catholics of Maryland called her Good Queen Anne ever after. Well, she died childless and was replaced with her cousin, the Elector of Hanover, George I. George I, and the one thing we got to bear in mind is that since the revolution that threw out her father, Parliament is sovereign in Britain and the Commonwealth. The king or the queen can do nothing that Parliament do not allow them to do. There's ceremonially, it's all done as it was in the Middle Ages. But the Act of Succession, 1689, means that Parliament decides who shall be king. And since Queen Anne, and this is seen as a great victory for the development of democracy, by the way, since Queen Anne, no British monarch has ever vetoed a bill.
Wow.
So they were very much, as you might say, prisoners, in a sense, of Parliament. But then when Queen Anne died, her cousin, the Elector of Hanover, came over. Now, Queen Anne, although she was subject to Parliament, she still presided over cabinet meetings. And she would appoint the prime minister as she chose. Mind you, it had to be somebody who could get bills through Parliament. And you could see where, if you remove the king entirely, how that turned into the party system. But at that juncture, she still would decide who would be prime minister from people who could get this stuff through. All right. So what happens then is really exciting, because George comes over and he doesn't speak any English. And not only does he not speak English, he doesn't care about England. He's interested in Hanover. So what happens under him and his son, George II, is that the prime minister takes over completely. That was the birth of the modern prime ministry, which again is seen as a victory for democracy. Isn't that wonderful? So now you've got the prime minister as supreme, and the king is completely a figurehead. Along comes George III, the grandson of George II. He was the first of the bunch to be born in England. He was the first for whom English was his first language. And when he came to the throne, he had an agenda. You betcha. He wanted to restore the Constitution, not to where it was under James, but under where it was under Queen Anne. In other words, he did not dispute the sovereignty of Parliament. What he did want was the right to rule as a monarch, to reign as Queen Anne had reigned. He was in favor, as I've said, of Catholic emancipation. And he began visiting the Catholic nobility and all that, and appointed a Lord Lieutenant to Ireland who was popular. Now, if you don't think that was a difficult feat. So what happened next, I've mentioned he had the treaty signed with France, which was a good deal for my people because we ended up missing out on the killing of our king. But the thing was that how do I put this? He did have an idea for reforming the English Constitution, the British Constitution, restoring it to what it had been. And the other problem, not just he, but anybody who would be in power in England faced, was that they had run up a ton of money defending the colonies during the 7 Years' War. Remember, every year they had to send over a new army, and every year my ancestors would shellac it until the last time, and then we lost. But that cost. And then there was the continuing cost of the Royal Navy and defending the coastlands, the frontier lands for the Indians. All right. Well, nobody figured the colonies would ever pull their own weight. They'd never done that before. There was no reason to expect them to do it now. But how do you get a symbolic amount out of them? Notice something interesting. Everything they wanted to tax at different times, whether it was tea or stamps or whatever, was stuff that only the wealthier colonists used. People always forget that. And the four wealthiest men in the colonies in 1775 were George Washington, John Hancock, Philip Schuyler, Charles Carroll of Carroll. You see, you've got to understand the revolution not as a fight for freedom from below, but as a typical revolution. The people who were just south of total power, but had a lot, wanted it completely. That was all on the one side. On the other side, there was the Whig oligarchy in England, who were very unhappy after the king appointed Lord North and had a prime minister of his own liking. These two things, the little oligarchies in America and the Whig oligarchy in England, between the two of them, they pretty much destroyed George III's attempts to reform the Constitution and ensured, after his time, that no British monarch would ever be able to do anything his government didn't want him to do. So, interestingly enough, though, when the British sent General Howe over to fight the Americans, 3 times he was part of the Whig oligarchy, and he was a member of Parliament on the Whig side. He comes to America, and without wanting to go into huge details, he basically threw the war. Up to the time that in 1778, the French came in and made it impossible for the British to win. Well, he comes back to England, he retires, he faces a board of inquiry, and they say, "Why'd you do that?" They give him all the lists of things that he had done. And he said, "The answer to that question is political, and I choose not to give it." So that was it for him. But the downside for the rest of us is that France and Spain intervening in the war, George took as a personal betrayal by his brother monarchs in supporting rebels. And that turned him off on Catholic emancipation. So that was one result of the revolution that people don't talk about. Another result they don't talk about is that if you look today at British governance, from the top to the bottom, from the king versus prime minister, House of Commons versus House of Lords, Lord Lieutenant and High Sheriff of the county to Chief of the County Council and Chief Constable, all the way down to the mayor and Chief of the City Council. All through British governance, there's a split between the ceremonial side and the practical side. That split was a direct result of our revolution. It didn't happen all at once, but that's basically, in the years since, that's what came out of it. Now, having said all of that, the interesting thing, there's a book I recommend you, Eric Nelson's Royalist Revolution. But he ends the book saying that when the revolution and our Constitution were finished, on one side of the water, you would have a monarchy without a king, and on the other, a king without a monarchy. And that's the way it's been ever since. So, looking at the current king, or his mother, or her father, or his father, as Henry VIII, is kind of like looking at Joe Biden as George Washington. It's actually not the same thing. I hate to break the news. And interestingly enough, Edward VII came into the church on his deathbed.
Wow, I didn't know that.
No, people don't. Why would you? Who would tell you? Remember, you, like myself, like everyone else, are products of a wonderful educational system. It's a wonder any of us can think at all. And I mean that in a nice way.
That's right. In spite of all the best efforts.
So I said to my dad once, Dad, I was thinking, Dad says, beginner's luck.
I'll use that one. Let's fast forward to this year, King Charles III. It was a big year for England, for the monarchy, and many subjects. It was clear that the English are still in love with the monarchy, even if it's really just a figurehead at this point. And
let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
When you see the flag on the 4th of July, you feel pride?
I have to say that my feelings have changed over a couple of decades. When I was
Let's
17,
go, let's go back to the beginning before the
yeah,
flag became abortion.
yeah,
Remember when you were a kid?
sure, of course. And I volunteered, right? At 17, I volunteered to serve. And I thought I was going to go defend the country and, you
Me
know,
too.
and perhaps be a hero, if that's what God desired. So sure, and I think St. Thomas talks about the, proper role of patriotism and so forth. So yes.
Well, the reason why I point this out is that for the British, the king is a living flag. The monarchy is the epitome of England and Scotland and Ireland. He represents a chain that goes back in unbroken succession to Alfred the Great. Remember what I told you about their keeping the form? Well, the form is not without some value. And that's why English Catholics, when American Catholics make kind of, dare I say, ignorant statements about it, they fly off the handle. Because it would be, well, my dad was in the Second World War. He was a tail gunner in B-29s and all that. And if I was going on about what he had done and someone said to me, oh, I see, so he was fighting for a Masonic Republic.
Right.
Uh, uh,
Yeah.
my reaction might be a little suboptimal.
Right.
I might not react very well. And so that was why, if you recall, going back, especially around the time of the coronation, man, did people get annoyed. And they got annoyed because when Americans talk about monarchy, they sound like morons.
Yeah.
The way, well, I mean, but why would it be otherwise? Because see, that's the immediate second thing. Okay, they sound like morons, but why would it be otherwise? It would be like when you hear Latin Americans talk about the United States. We are not simply a Masonic republic that's out to destroy Catholicism. Although, if you just study our foreign policy, you might think that. And that, you see, is what I always tell people. If you want to hate my country, study the history of our foreign policy. And you'll be able to decide that we've always been a force for evil. If you want to love my country, come to the United States and take a long road trip. Do anywhere you want, just make it long. See as much as you can, stay off the freeway. See what you can. And I guarantee you, by the time you're finished, you'll love the United States. Of course, if you do both, you'll be hard-pressed to believe that it's the same country. You go to a bunch, even of Baptist church-going church picnic in Alabama, and you want to compare that to driving the Catholic Church out of the Philippines, which, yes, we did. The only reason why the church was allowed to come back, so to speak, was the Vatican made a deal with the U.S. government and got rid of all the Spanish bishops and replaced them with Irish ones, so it was all right. And you have to use the same sort of subtlety you would hope people would use in looking at our country. You have to try to apply to other countries, even to the British, even though they speak the same language, not as well as we do, but they try. You have to bear in mind that when things mean a lot to you, now things mean a lot to them too. They don't see Henry VIII. They see the crown that predates the Reformation. They see a living link to a Catholic order in a way that we just don't have. We've got a living link to Freemasonry. We do have that. We have a living link to the Enlightenment. Okay, great. That's, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. And again, there are reasons for it. In both cases, I hope you see, I'm trying to avoid making the complex simple. I know we want it to be simple because that way we can feel good. Because then it's simple. I can make a quick judgment, decide whatever I want right now. But see, real life isn't like that. And if you try to do that, reality will smack you in the face every bloody time. So the next question that could be asked about King Charles is, isn't he an adulterer? I forget. Oh, and a one worlder. Did I mention that? And then, hold on. I can do this. Oh, Great Reset. Yeah. Oh, no, wait, please don't help me. I work best without a net. One worlder, adulterer. And a Freemason. Well, let's look at each of those, shall we? Before we go on to the other side of the king, which is actually what his people see that we don't. As far as his adultery goes, you bet. And he many times has publicly talked about it and confessed his sorrow at the whole thing. When people do that, you either say okay or you don't. But then if you say, no, I'm not taking his, I don't believe he's at all repentant. Yes, well, it's a good thing you died and became God. I'm very happy for you. As judge of the living and the dead, I wish you well at your own judgment. Second, the whole one world thing and the environmentalism and all that. We'll touch on the environmentalism in a minute. There is not a person today in a position of high rank, and that includes the dear Holy Father, who doesn't have to deal with other people like that. I guarantee you, if you're in any kind of position of power, you'll have been to Davos. It's just the way it is. Does that make you a member of the Illuminati? No, it doesn't. What it does mean is that like people deal with like people, and you will very likely have the same superstitions they have. You probably believe in climate change and the population explosion. Certainly the Holy Father does. Did I mention you should never expect more out of the king than you do out of the Pope? Did I say anything about that? Yeah, we shouldn't. If you expect more out of the king than out of the Pope, you really are an Anglican. But, and believe me, I don't expect that much out of either, but never mind. Let's move along. So, my favorite part is about his being a Freemason. Not only is that not true, it's completely untrue. I mean, it's the reverse of true, but I'll explain what I mean. Traditionally, as in the United States, Freemasonry was very tied up with the establishment. We haven't had too many presidents who weren't Freemasons. But, and of course, if you really want some fun, go to the George Washington National Masonic Memorial out in Alexandria, Virginia. I always recommend it highly to anybody. You'll get a view of things. And they have an authentic reconstruction of the Masonic Lodge that President Washington presided over. They have his apron, too. It's great. You could touch it. I think there may have been a few healings, but I'm not sure. Maybe not. I could have made that part up. I don't know. But the apron is there. That you can say. So, I'm sorry. I just had a vision of someone going there and touching the thing. I'm healed. Anyway, so the thing is that traditionally, well, not traditionally, but several kings, including Edward VII, who came into the church on his deathbed, were the nominal heads of the Grand Lodge of England, which is just like every one of our states has a Grand Lodge. Well, England, Scotland, and Ireland each have their Grand Lodges, but the king is only, when he's a member, he's only the head of the Grand Lodge of England. Well, that was true for Edward VII, George V, George VI. George VI dies. Now, Queen Elizabeth could not be a Freemason because she's a chick. And they wouldn't let her into the Rainbow Girls for some reason. I guess because it's all American. Anyway, so Prince Philip refused to become a Freemason, presumably because of his Greek Orthodox background. The only Orthodox who were really tolerant of Freemasonry, to my knowledge, some of the Russians and the Serbians, but mostly the Greeks in particular don't like them. So he wouldn't do it, and then Prince Charles wouldn't do it. He wouldn't join the order. So the head of the Grand Lodge of England today is the late Queen's first cousin, the Duke of Kent. But what's interesting about that is that the Duke of Kent's wife, the Duchess, is a convert to Catholicism, as is her son, Lord Nicholas Windsor, who's, I guess you would say, in terms of social cachet, the highest ranking Catholic in Britain. So you have this strange setup where the king refused to join the order. And that was unheard of for 150 years. Well, now let's flip it around. I have read an awful lot of what he's actually written. And I have looked at the different charities he backs. Without wanting to go into too much detail, I would say I agree with a good 75% of what he has to say. And what's funny about that number is that it's more than almost anybody I've ever been asked to vote for. You got an interesting side of him in several ways. One, they had said before he became king for a long time, for 10 years, that he would take the name George VII. Why? Because Charles is identified with the Catholic Stuarts. Charles I, who lost his head, we talked about. Charles II, his son, who came into the church on his deathbed. And the real Charles III, Bonnie Prince Charlie. So everyone said, and it was intimated that it was coming from Clarence House, that he was not going to be called Charles III. His mother dies, and he takes the name Charles III. But what does he mean by that? I don't know. I know that he's expressed his admiration for St. Catherine of Siena. I know that he's very interested in Eastern Orthodoxy. I know he went to Mass in Rome, which provoked a lot of upset when he was Prince of Wales. I know he did things like that. Is he a crypto-Catholic? I don't think so. Is he friendlier to Catholicism than a lot of Protestants in Britain would be comfortable with? Yeah, I would guess. But wait, there's more. He has the Christmas message. Now, imagine that you're the king. And imagine that you have what is for you, as Catholics who wouldn't see it that way, but for you, it's a pretty clearly defined Christian belief. But most of your subjects, both at home and in Canada, Australia, and all that, are not Christian. And you have inherited the throne, and you have a duty to them because you're supposed to be their father, despite the fact that you have absolutely no power. Isn't that great? There's a wonderful place to be in, and I can't recommend it highly enough for somebody other than myself. I would do anything than that if I could. So, in the Christmas message, he did a very interesting thing. He had a clip of himself next to the grotto at Bethlehem where our Lord was born. And he says, there's the birthplace of our Lord Jesus Christ as told in the gospel. And I thought to myself, well, that's pretty straightforward. But then he went on about Christmas. The spirit of Christmas is something that, people of all faiths and none can take part in, and so on and so forth, which in his position is about the best you can do. On the one hand, assert your own faith, and on the other hand, attempt to relate to all your other subjects of whatever faith or none. Then the coronation. Well, the coronation, I mean, there's a lot that could be said about it for different reasons. What struck me was his personal prayer, which they never had that in a coronation before. The coronation, by the way, is the remnant of a Catholic rite. When he was given the sword and told to use it to defend and restore things and so on and so forth, that's a direct, you'll see that in the old Pontificale. That's a direct thing from the old rite, the Catholic rite of coronation. Of course, he took the oath to uphold the Church of England, and when he was acceded, he took the oath to uphold the Church of Scotland. That's part of the British Constitution. What would happen to an American president who said he didn't want to take the oath to the Constitution? What would happen, do you think?
I,
especially.
I think they
I'm
would
sorry.
impeach him. I mean, they would probably, the Congress would probably refuse, right?
Well, yeah, but what if he was a Catholic and it was before Roe v. Wade was quashed, and he said, "I can't take that oath because abortion's in it." Well, I don't know what would have happened then. Well, and of course, you know very well that's never going to happen. And why would it? Why should it? How could it? So, long and the short of it is that I was very impressed by several of the things he did during the coronation. Another interesting thing was that he had the chrism that he was anointed with, blessed by the Greek Orthodox Patriarch of Jerusalem. And so this was the first time since James II was crowned in 1685 that a king has been anointed with chrism that we Catholics would consider valid. And the Holy Father gave him some pieces of the true cross, which he turned around and had erected into a beautiful processional cross, which was used at the front of the procession. Now, what's interesting about that, and they're now part of the crown jewels, a number of Catholic monarchies in days gone by, and you can see some of these things, part of their sets of crown jewels were a processional cross like that. England never had one, and now it does. So you look at these things, you look at the totality. Is the king perfect? By no means. But as I say, I think he's much better than the vast majority of the creatures I've been asked to vote for. And for all his failings, for his Catholic subjects, he sums up their country like a living flag, as I've said. When you're being loyal to the king, you're not simply being loyal to Charles Windsor. You're being loyal to the crown, to England, to Scotland, to Wales, Northern Ireland. And your ancestors and his go back a long, long time. Now, mind you, being a Jacobite myself, I'd rather it was the head of the House of Wittelsbach who was being crowned, but we'll leave that aside.
In
fact,
go ahead.
No, I was just going to say I'd even be happy if the head of the Wittelsbach got Bavaria back, but never mind. Go ahead.
So, do you think that there is a great danger for Catholics to, and I accept what you've said earlier, that we, in my words, we are effectively projecting on the flag our best dreams, hopes, principles in terms of what the United States stands for, and that the English are in some similar way projecting upon their king those same things? Is there a danger in that, in terms of the enthusiasm that we might have for that kind of patriotism as Catholics who are trying to recognize the very grave threats to our faith and to our families in the modern age?
Believe it or not, I think there's a lot less of that for the English than there is for us. The reason being that the English also have, the English Catholics I'm speaking of now, have a long history of recusancy. Remember, the first English Catholic to be presented with a problem of this nature was St. Thomas More. And what did he say? I am the king's good servant, but God's first. But hold that for a moment. I am the king's good servant. And he was. And he was a better servant to the king than all the yes men and losers and time servers and opportunists that flocked around him like so many flies on a piece of dead meat. If he went to hell, and I wouldn't be surprised, it was because of the ministrations of those servants. St. Thomas More loved his king, and he loved his country. And Catholics from that time to this in England and Scotland and Ireland have been able to make that distinction. We American Catholics often have not been able to make that distinction. I mean, how many of us, and this isn't restricted to Catholics, it's an American trait, for how many of us, once the Supreme Court ruled that abortion, that infanticide, that the murder of infants was part of the Constitution, for how many of us did half our fight go out of us? Because for various historic reasons I could go on and on and on about, in America, what is legal is moral. What is moral is legal. And effectively, the vast majority of Americans have always made the Supreme Court their conscience. The one major exception, of course, was prohibition. But, that reached something that was, more important than any other issue you can think of. Not that, we're thirsty or anything.
And they did get that right after a few years.
Yeah, it took a while. Now that was an experiment that failed.
Indeed. Shockingly, it took longer to correct Roe than it did prohibition.
It's not too much of a shock. If you don't have an abortion yourself, and most people don't, I mean, half the population are men, and most of the remaining half are probably not going to have abortions. Whereas the vast majority of people could use a drink now and then.
Yeah.
It's kind of funny when you think about it. I don't want to get off on this tangent too much, but it's funny when you think about it that because of prohibition, criminality became respectable in a way it never had, because people like Al Capone and all that were helping people overcome manifestly unjust laws. One of the things that became very popular was to come up drunk to a cop. Because see, if you didn't have any booze on you, but there's no law against being drunk. I mean, if you were disorderly, yeah, drinking disorderly. But, you can come up stinking of whiskey and you breathe on him, good evening, officer, and you just go your way. There's nothing you can do. But people love doing that. Yeah. I wouldn't include my grandparents in that number, but they told me about bad people who did bad things like that.
Yeah.
But seriously, I don't know where we got with that, but there it is. It did a lot of damage to the social fabric of the United States. Prohibition did. But with that exception, look at the way smoking went. If it's legal, it's moral. If it's moral, it's legal. And I've had people argue with me that prohibiting smoking is within the right of the government because of all the amount of money the government puts out on lung cancer. And I said, really? So what you're telling me then is that if the government have to put out a lot of money because of illnesses caused by behavior, they have the right to outlaw that behavior, right? Yes, exactly right. So you want to ban sodomy? Because the government have spent a lot more on AIDS than they have on lung cancer. So that's what you're telling me. Gotcha. Well, no, of course not. And again, notice that after the Supreme Court ruled the anti-sodomy laws unconstitutional, suddenly not only did they all collapse, but now, if you even mention that they ever were, you might be guilty of a hate crime. That's the American mentality, you see. The English have other problems, but that they don't have. They don't think like that, but we do. And there are reasons for it. I mean, again, if you don't understand the historical reasons for anything, and it's not you, I mean, anything you do is, of course, obviously it makes perfect sense. But if you don't understand the historic reasons for something, it's just stupid. But of course, in making that assertion, because it is for a reason, and people who know, well, then you look stupid. And that, it's a grave problem. We also have this rush to judgment on everything. My late father used to say that you don't really have to have an opinion about anything you don't know anything about. And that it's okay to say, I don't know. If you don't really know something about something, feel free not to express an opinion. We don't have to have an opinion on every bloody thing because there's only so much any of us can know. He used to say also that if all these polls and so forth they take were honest, a full 75 to 95% of any given poll would be, I don't know, I don't care about anything. And then, because let's face it, most of us, we only know what we know and what we know. And I think that a big part of the problem both in addressing issues of governance, issues of whether they be British or American, is that we're all of us encouraged to express our opinion. It's very democratic, but we have no basis upon which to have an opinion. You got to know stuff. And we don't. We are the least educated generation imaginable. Mine was supposed to be the most educated, by the way. The boomers. We're so smart. You can tell. But it never fails to astonish me, especially dealing now with younger people, how they're taught nothing. You know, I went to a terribly gang-ridden junior high school in inner city LA. I don't want to mention which one, but it was Virgil Junior High. Oh, I'm sorry. Was that a plug? But it was really a terrible setup in many, many ways. But you know what? We read the Iliad and the Odyssey. Think about that. Now, we didn't read it in Greek, but we read the Iliad and the Odyssey in, I guess it would have been 8th grade. Could you imagine today's 8th graders doing that in, oh, I don't know, Exeter?
I think they read Harry Potter.
If they're lucky, because he's got big words. I think they need to dumb down Harry Potter for the modern audience. That's real. JK needs to go back, rewrite, and get rid of all those words of over 2 syllables. But no, I mean, this is where we're at, and it's on the basis of this kind of education that we not only express opinions based on that, but then we go to the mattresses on Twitter and Facebook and so forth, and excoriate everyone who disagrees with us. The best part is always, sorry?
I was going to say social media certainly brings the French dream of equality to kind of a new level, right? Egalitarianism.
It sure does. I mean, we're all equally stupid.
Right.
And the big problem there too, you know, the ad hominem is always a declaration of loss. If I say, well, you just hate Henry VIII because you're a stupid Catholic American, you know what? You may be right or you may be wrong, but I'm wrong. I'm just wrong. I have no argument. The minute I descend to that level, I have nothing to say. And you can happily disregard anything that comes out of my mouth because there's nothing worth listening to. And the ad hominem reigns supreme. It you know, well, you only say that because, no, I only say it maybe because I know something. How about you? Well, you only know that because you studied it. I did have one person say something kind of interesting to me, though. I'll never forget it. Why do you always confuse these questions with facts? It shut me up. I had no response. Really, I had no answer to that one. Closed me right down.
That's a great one. I want to return to one subject. You mentioned Freemasonry, and in a lot of traditional circles, this is still a big topic with a lot of writing and talking about the Freemasons and the threat that they represent to the faithful, to mankind in general. There's at least one contrarian view by a well-known Catholic author, and he suggests that Freemasonry basically was extinguished by its success, that the revolutions in Europe and in England and America were essentially the aim of the Masons, and that their revolutionary agenda in the world has essentially been accomplished. He of course cites a different group of people who represent the threat to Catholicism in particular. What would you say about that?
I'd say there's a certain amount of truth to it. There's a sense in which all of us moderns are, to a degree, ideological Freemasons. Now, what do I mean when I say that? I don't mean to say we all worship the Grand Architect. No. What I mean by that is that the vast majority of us, as Pope Benedict XVI said it, though not using those terms, we believe in conduct over creed. It doesn't matter what you believe as long as you're a nice person, good fellow. And that's the basic dogma of the Enlightenment. It's the basic dogma of Freemasonry. The way Pope Benedict put it is that today the vast majority of Catholics are functionally universalists. And that universalism comes to us from, in varying degrees, varying ways, from the Enlightenment, from Freemasonry, all that. Certainly as an institution, as a local institution, Freemasonry is suffering the same decline that all participatory organizations are suffering. Young people aren't interested in, doing anything beyond, excuse me. Oh, I'm sorry, we were still on. And that has had the result of stifling not just the Masonic Lodge, but everything from the Knights of Columbus to the local garden clubs, which, if you think about it, and you think about the multiplicity of groups like that, they do a lot in terms of keeping any community running. So there's a certain amount of truth to it on that level. I suppose I can guess the other group he has in mind. But there too, nature abhors a vacuum. We Catholics can't run a church. How are we supposed to animate a society? I told you earlier that every state has an animating principle, an animating philosophy. Well, at the end of the day, the defeat of Catholicism is not because of its enemies. It's because of its members and its leadership. When I was a kid in the 70s, we had a song, Smiling Faces. Smiling faces hold no traces. Sometimes they don't tell the truth. It's sung by blacks, but it had a line in it. You don't have to worry about your enemy because you know who he is. It's your friend. Him you got to worry about. And in a certain sense, for Catholics, that's been the case. We've accepted all sorts of things. And again, they were brought to us by people in hierarchy, and how do I put this? Periods of crisis in the church resemble each other in some degree, but they're never the same. We never had all but 5 bishops of the church deny the divinity of Christ until we did, and then we didn't have it again. We never had 3 popes at once until we did. Then it never happened again. And so it goes. Well, similarly, the period of history we're going through in the church with a apparent total turning on their back of their jobs of so many of the hierarchy, we've never had anything quite like it. And if, as and when we get through this, as I'm sure we shall, it'll never happen again like this. It'll be something else the next time, presuming there is a next time, and these aren't the last days, which, you've always got to keep as the back card on the deck. The joker in the deck is always the last days. But if with any luck we're not, that isn't now, then we'll come through this, and then we'll be able to pull ourselves together and get back to doing the job of evangelization. But we have to shake off this ultimate lack of belief in the faith. You see, we don't believe it's necessary. We don't believe in the salvation of souls. We don't believe in the sacraments. Not really. When I say we, obviously a lot of people do. But I mean, the generality of us, if you ask us about this or that point of the creed, we'll agree to it. But what does it mean to us in everyday life? What is it, what is it really about? And very often, rather than, and look, I know it's difficult to evangelize, to spread the faith to non-Catholics when the church herself is in such disarray. But we still have to. during the great Christological heresies of the 4th and 5th centuries, and during the big Gnostic problems, the 2nd and 3rd. People didn't sit around and say, well, you know what? Let's wait until this gets sorted out, and then I'll talk to my next door neighbor about the faith. Then I'll tell my Jupiter-loving Aunt Hypatia about it. No, and if they had waited for it, believe me, the neighbor in Hypatia would have gone to wherever pagans go. So this is, I think, an important thing. The Freemasons, the other people, the others, I think he meant the Eloi, or possibly the elves, I'm not sure, the Martians. But whoever he meant, we're the problem, not them. We need to reinforce our prayer life. We need to evangelize. We need to be the sort of Catholic we think everybody else should be. You know, I remember in my brother and his family were going to back in the evil days of the indult, we're going to a mass on a regular basis in Florida. And the priest said both the Novus Ordo and for the indult mass, but he was very trad-minded. He was describing something about the Liturgy of the Hours, the divine office in the pulpit. And he sort of slipped and said something about, until the reform of 1970, meaning the reform of the office. Well, a friend of my brother's after the sermon was, oh man, was he fit to be tied? What does he mean reformed? It was ruined. They did this, they did that. He's going on and on and on. And my brother looks at him and says, so do you and your family do the divine office at home? And if you do you do it, obviously you do the pre-Vatican II version, we know this, but you do it in English or Latin? Just curious. Well, of course, dead silence. Outrage is not the same thing as piety. Anger is not zeal. Sometimes you have to get angry when you're zealous, but they're not the same thing. And if you allow the one to replace the other, well, then the devil is getting you in an alternate way. That's the thing we must never forget, is that the devil wants each of us, and he will use what tempts us. I guarantee you, the devil will never come to you and say, all the green bricks in the world will I give you if you'll follow me. Because, that's not really a very tempting offer. No, thank you, Satan. I don't think so. Dead turtles? No. Old milk cans? No. He gives us temptations we'll fall for. And again, if the past several generations of Catholics had been that great, we wouldn't be where we are now. And I know some people tell me I'm gaslighting us and things like that. It's not about gaslighting. Things can't get better until you improve, and the only control you've got, generally speaking, is over you anyway. Let me ask you a question. Let's say that the king, the pope, and the president were all as evil as you could possibly imagine. So much so that all I'd have to do is see a picture of them, and I'd be ready to break things. And I'm so angry all the time at them. Okay, and doubtless because we've said they're evil. And exactly what is this going to do? Who's it going to benefit? Is it going to benefit me? No. Is it going to do anything? Will it stop the president, the king, and the pope from doing their terrible, evil, wicked things? No. It'll make me feel good about myself. And see, when we use that religion to feel good about ourselves, contrary to every self-help life coach you've ever heard, then we're making a mistake. I mean, mind you, we shouldn't go the Calvinist route and just use it to feel bad about ourselves either. It's not really my point. But the faith is about what we should be doing, not about what we should be getting. I mean, why do we go to the traditional mass or the indult mass or the Eastern Rite liturgy? Why do we try to perform the spiritual and corporal acts of mercy? Why do we try to educate the young people in our lives in the faith? Why do we do any of this stuff? Ultimately, it's to save our souls. And what contributes to the salvation of our souls is good. What does not is not. And these things are much wider categories than you might think. If reading Shakespeare puts you in a more sublime mood and makes you more appreciative of what God has done for you and the glories of our Catholic civilization, you know what? Reading Shakespeare is conducing toward your salvation. If, on the other hand, reading Shakespeare, you think, boy, this is better than the Bible or the Church Fathers. Shakespeare was it. I got no use for this other garbage. Well, then Shakespeare isn't conducing to your salvation, is he?
Yeah, indeed, we've got to remind ourselves that God is, in His wisdom, put us in this time and place,
Yes.
for a reason, according to His omniscience, and it's our duty to look at these circumstances and to grow in faith and trust in Him and perseverance in our own life and so forth. We've covered a lot of ground. As we wrap up here, I've got two questions for you. One is getting back to the questions of American government, kind of this idea of representative government, a republic or a democracy. Is that form of representative government, in your mind, essentially contrary to Catholicism?
I wouldn't say per se, because the Middle Ages had it. The Estates of the Realm and all that. The way we have it, I mean, again, we have to go back to how these sorts of things developed. You'll remember that both St. Thomas and Aristotle thought that there were three kinds of government, and they had their three evil shadows, if you like. Monarchy versus tyranny, aristocracy versus oligarchy, and polity, which is basically ruled by the majority of stakeholders, veterans, landowners, people with a real part in the rule. And then democracy was the, rule by the mob. The demos was the evil equivalent. But they both said that the best form of government combines the three. And in the Middle Ages, and that includes England, the form of government with the king and the estates of the realm, the lords and commons. And bear in mind, commons weren't everybody and his brother. Commons were the landholders and some other people, the heads of universities, people like that. The king and his estates were considered to be mixed government. The king decided policy, and if he needed more money to carry it out than his own estates would bring him, then he'd have to go around, turn to the estates of the realm, to the people who basically would have to pay for it, and ask them to approve it. That's how legislatures arose in the Middle Ages. And that, I mean, the details varied country to country, but it was basically the same from England to Russia. Well, not Russia, but Poland. And that's representative government, represents people with a stake in the thing. One of my little jokes, of course, is that they said mixed government was the best. They combined those three: monarchy, democracy, aristocracy, and polity. What neither of them talked about, and what we have managed to accomplish in our day, is mixed government that combines the three bad governments, so that we have tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy. See, they never even thought of that. This never, it doesn't, you don't see it anywhere. We have mixed government too. It's just a bad mix. Garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah.
Anyhow, seriously. So I would say not necessarily. It again, it depends on the nature of the representation, who's being represented. Justice enters into this. And I'll give you a concrete example. We're not going to go to the Middle Ages or Aristotle for this. We'll go to the immediate. Bond issues. Now, bond issues are based on property taxes. Okay, I don't own any property. The home I have in California, I rent it. I don't own a thing. So when a bond issue comes up, number one, I believe there should be different roles of voters. I don't think I should be able to vote for a bond issue because I'm not going to be paying for it. So I always vote no, even if it's something I really agree on, like a new library or something. I'll always vote no because it's not my place to decide where other people's money is going when I'm not contributing. That's simple justice. Now, mind you, I'm all for everybody being able to vote on sales taxes because guess what? Everybody's got to pay them. So it makes sense that everybody and his brother should have to pay for a sales tax, but not property taxes, and certainly not inheritance taxes. My dad didn't leave me anything but a few books. So why should I be voting on something like that? And that, so as I say, it can be in accordance with Catholic teaching. It's just, what is the nature of it? Are the bishops represented? There's another one for you. Because, of course, in the medieval estates, the bishops, and very often, if they had them, the abbots sat amongst the, the governance of the realm. And that was just the way it was done. Because you had, again, what they called in France, the three estates. In other places, there were four, because they divide the commons into country people and city people. But whichever it was, those were the three or four estates that made up the totality of the realm. One of the frequent motifs in medieval art, you'll see a picture of a priest, a knight, and a peasant. And under the priest, it says, I bless all. Under the knight, it says, I defend all. Under the peasant, it says, I feed all. And it makes sense that those who contribute to the common good should be represented on some level. I mean, somebody has to have the final say. But the concerns, et cetera, the people who are supposed to foot the bill for it really need to be taken account of, one way or the other.
That leads very well into my final question. If we think about a truly Catholic state, and I know you've written some books that touch on this. One is the Star Spangled Crown. If we think about a truly Catholic state, who votes? Do the non-Catholics have a full role in the body politic? Or if there's not a voting mechanism, who serves in the government to be part of the execution of policies and laws?
Well, a lot depends on the proportion of Catholics in the population. If the vast majority of people in a given country are Catholic, then it makes perfect sense that they should be the citizenry. If you have substantial non-Catholic elements, then they have to be represented somehow. That was certainly the case in Austria-Hungary, where they had a particularly protected role in society, and where, oddly enough, the Catholic emperor was the head of the Protestant church in his country. Just like King Charles is the head of the Church of England, Franz Joseph was the head of both the Calvinist and the Lutheran churches of Austria. And the Catholic kings of Bavaria and Saxony were the heads of the Protestant churches in their countries. But that, in turn, that headship gave the Protestants a particular place in society. Now then, if you come to a setup like ours, where we're a small minority, then separation of church and state as a expedient, if it gives the church complete freedom, is something that's acceptable. If it doesn't, then, you know, and often, of course, people will say, well, the two things I get. One is, well, you think the church should have special favors. Well, yeah, because it's true. I mean, what do you want me to say? Do you think that when it comes to designing maps, believers in the flat earth should have equal rights with believers in the round earth? I mean, I get it if you say they should. All right, fine. I don't want to fly a plane with you, but yeah. I mean, there has to be somewhere acceptance of the fact that Catholicism is objectively true and objectively real. And see, we don't really. The very fact that we feel kind of, oh, I don't know, because we don't really believe. We don't believe that the Catholic faith, that the four creeds are as real as the income tax. And that's why we have this weird feeling of misgiving, because we don't really believe. Which, you know, why should we? If you can't expect more out of the king than you can out of the Pope, you can't expect more out of yourself than out of the Pope, can you?
Indeed.
But seriously, it is true, though, that these things will happen organically as the country becomes Catholic. I mean, it's important to bear in mind that nobody sat around coming up with the Catholic state. Catholic monarchy was not, there was no blueprint. It developed organically out of the encounter between the faith and the pre-existing institutions of Rome on the one hand and the Germanic tribes on the other. And this confluence of these three are what produced Christendom, or four if you want to count the Slavs. And that's what did it. And so similarly, we've come so far down the hill. But if, as and when we make our way up the hill again, then things will alter organically. In Star Spangled Crown, I basically put a Catholic king at the head of the United States. But you'll notice that to do that, he had to make an awful lot of compromises, because that's exactly what you would have to do in his position. Like King Charles in the Christmas speech, you'd have to somehow assert your own identity, while at the same time making room for your non-Catholic subjects.
Mhm.
Obviously, it's a different story if 99.9% of your people are Catholic. But if 25% are not and 75% are, it's a different story. If 40% and you're Catholic and 40% of your subjects are Catholic, then you've got to make arrangements for the majority. And then if your people are a small minority, like the King of Saxony was, I mean, he was king, but only 10% of Saxons were Catholic. And the majority were members of the state church, of which he was head. And that created a series of circumstances that he had to live with. And that the Holy See, incidentally, and mind you, we're not talking about wild-eyed modernists oozing out of Vatican II. They had to come up with means of allowing the King of Saxony to do that. It was the same for James II when he was crowned king in 1685 with the valid oil, but by what we would consider a layman, the Archbishop of Canterbury, just like Charles III this past year. As a Catholic, he nevertheless became head of the Church of England and head of the Church of Scotland with papal approval. It all depends on the circumstances you find yourself in. I would not want to be, I wouldn't want to be a king anyway, but I would not want to be a king in a position like that. One of the, you may recall, one of the, I thought it was funny. One of the things I did with Star Spangled Crown was that I made the governors all appointed by the king. And I said, in accord with the Constitution as it was, that states could have an established faith or not. They couldn't discriminate against anyone for not belonging to it, but if a given state wanted to financially establish and support a state church, they could do it, because that's the way the Constitution was when it was written. So I mentioned on the one hand, I mentioned in the thing that Utah was the first state of the union to take advantage of this. But since then, no governor of Utah, no Mormon has ever been appointed governor of Utah. And I think that that's actually, if in the completely unbelievable and improbable world that I created there, if that ever actually happened, I suspect that they would do something like that. You know, the Mormon Church would become the established church in Utah, but for the sake of the Gentiles, the king would never appoint a Mormon to that post. And yet, as governor of Utah, he would have to find a way to, shall we say, ceremonially deal with the Mormon Church on some. There would have to be a structured, established way in which he dealt with them.
Yeah. Perhaps one day that'll be a question for Catholics to.
I wouldn't hold my breath on that. But I would say that while I don't believe anything remotely like what I wrote in the book is ever going to happen, I was very happy that people wrote me, and I said that and said, "Oh, I wish it was. I'd love to live in that world. It would be kind of fun."
There might be a lot of trial and tribulation between here and there.
Yeah. I think the end of the world is like there, frankly, but never mind. And I don't think the end of the world is likely. So,
well, you've got a book that you're about to publish. Would you tell us about that?
yeah, well, I'm working on it as we speak. I stole precious time from my publishers to be on this show today. Please don't feel too guilty. Not you or our audience. It's all right. As a living martyr, I do. Never mind. Anyway, no, it's I'm actually doing two at once. The one is the life of the Empress Zita, the wife of Blessed Emperor Charles. She's a servant of God. He was the subject of my last book, so this is sort of a sequel, sort of not. I cover a lot of the same territory, though, from a somewhat different point of view. I made a point of not rereading my my last book because I wanted to do this just totally different thing. Then the other book, a little bit on the same level. It's a collection of the writings of the Archduke Otto, their son, about the United States. He wrote a lot for the American press in the 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s. So I'm going to bring up some of the pieces he wrote that I think are most important. The introductory sections will deal with his life, his relationship with the United States, which was actually very close. And before that, the relationship of the House of Habsburg with the United States, which was also much closer than people realize. Just to give you one little tidbit. In 1829, the Emperor Franz I founded the Leopoldinen Stiftung, the Leopoldine Society, named after his youngest daughter, who was Empress of Brazil and died young. Anyway, it functioned until 1914, and while it functioned, it funneled from both from the Habsburgs and from a lot of other Austrians who contributed millions of dollars to the Catholic Church in the United States. They founded 400 parishes, 300. They supported 300 priests, including St. John Neumann and Bishop Araga. You hear about these people coming over here. You hear about them doing this, doing that. That's nice. Where'd the money come from? Well, a lot of it came from the Leopoldine Society. And see, that's not remembered in Austria today because, pardon me, the fly swatter fell. It's not remembered in Austria because, of course, the Austrian establishment like to blacken the name of the Habsburgs any way they can. It's not remembered in the United States because while we have many, 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 many virtues, we Americans are so full of virtue, it's just astonishing. We wallow in it. But if there's one we lack, it's gratitude. And so we don't remember. And yet, all over the United States, there are churches that they funded, and not just with money and not just with priests. They sent stuff, vestments, chasubles, chalices, windows, statues. And you'll go to a parish and you'll see a statue of the Sacred Heart, a little thing on it saying "Gift for the Leopoldine Society." That was primarily Habsburg money that went into that statue you're looking at. Do we remember? We don't remember. And that, there are other things like that. The Archduke Leopold Salvator came to L.A. in the 1800s and wrote a book about it in the 1880s. So you're going to hear a little bit about what a 19th century Habsburg Archduke thought of America's greatest city. If you believe that, not that he wrote it, that's true, but if you believe it's the greatest city, ladies and gentlemen, well, great. Lucky for you. You obviously have never lived there. There'll be other things like that. Franz Ferdinand, who got killed at Sarajevo, he made a tour of the United States in 1893, and his diaries, what he had to say about America, are fascinating and very true even today. We've got a lot of energy. We do a lot of stuff. We're very much about doing things. We lack a certain humanity and will fall for anything that's advertised. We love advertising. It was true then, it's true now. I mean, how could it not be true? They said it in an advertisement. Those are all vetted for accuracy, aren't they? So hucksterism has always been a big part of our character, going back to the Yankee peddler, in colonial days. And that was one thing Franz Ferdinand picked up on, was hucksterism. He went to the great Chicago exhibition, the White City, in 1893, and he saw, there's so much that's wonderful and great about this country mixed up with such, he didn't say terrible things, but, bizarre and peculiar, used words like that. And I think, I think it's perfectly fair. It's to my way of thinking, it's one of the things I love about the country, is our bizarre, somewhat out of it nature. I'd rather we're entirely Catholic, but there's a reason we keep coming up with weird cults. It's we generate more than any other country on earth, and people never stop to ask why. Well, it's part of our culture. And the thing is, if you look at the history of the United States, New England was the breeding ground of weird cults in the beginning. Christian Science, the Mormons, I mean, they came out of upstate New York, but they were all Yankees from New England who moved. Christian Science, New Thought, all that kind of stuff. Then it moves after the Civil War to the Midwest. It sits there for a couple of decades and finally finds its true home. You guessed it, in Southern California, where the sun always shines and brains aren't necessary. And why should they be?
Thank you so much for spending this time with us today. A perfect way to end. How can people reach you?
Well, unless they send money, I don't want. Oh no, sorry, wrong. Sorry, I've got a cough there. No, several ways. You can watch my podcasts. I've got 2 a week. Lucky you, or lucky me. One is is called Off the Menu, and that's at the YouTube channel Tumblar House, Tumblar. And then I've got a regular series as well, a podcast at Virgin Most Powerful Radio, VPMR. Wait a minute,
PR.
yeah, VMPR Radio, VMPR.org, called The Never Ending Struggle, where I look at different episodes in Catholic history. You can read my shorter stuff, my periodical work, if you like. You can read it on Catholicism.org, the European Conservative, Crisis magazine, and 1 Peter 5. I think that's about all I'm doing right now. The Jersey Rural, that's the other one, from the island of Jersey, not the state of New Jersey, the real one. That's the Jersey Rural Magazine on their website, not in the magazine. The magazine is purely devoted to local issue, but they've started to get into bigger stuff on their website. And I think that pretty much that if you want to communicate with me, you can do so through Tumblr House online, or you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. I hope that's it. I mean, what's difficult is that you'll get messages from people and you don't know if you've been emailed, Instagrammed, Facebooked, tweeted, signaled, WhatsApped. You know somebody sent you a message, but then you've got to go hunting for it, and you don't remember which medium it was on. Welcome to the 21st century. We hope you'll be happy here because you don't have a choice.
These are the crosses that we're called to bear, right?
Yeah, really, first world problems. But no, thanks a lot for having me. It's been a lot of fun. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have.
It's been great. Thank you for sharing so much of your time with us. God bless.
You, man. God bless you.